So I'm just going to pull it up again. That way it's on the recording for my submission and get your verbal consent, and then we can start. So then one last time, can I just get your consent that I went through the form with you and that you are consenting to be video and audio recorded?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so my first question is that focusing around the mission of the Esperanza itself, like I said, the idea behind it is to showcase different organizations. So how would you describe the Esperanza to someone who has no idea about the work that you do, or maybe someone from out of town?
Well, we're an almost 35-year-old social justice cultural arts organization in San Antonio, based in San Antonio, but I think with a reach that is outside of San Antonio. It's regional, it's statewide, it's also national, it's also international. And the vision that we had initially was to be a place of where people of that believed in social, economic, environmental, and gender justice could find a home and be able to meet there. And if you were interested in environmental justice, but then you were somebody else was coming in and they were having a meeting around LGBT issues, they would bump into each other and then they would start talking, and then there'd be some synergy created and people then would start working, uh, connecting with each other in those other issues. It was a moment again before there were computers, so people, it's like, let's buy a computer and we'll all share a computer. Let's buy a copier machine and let's all share the copier. Let's have a newsletter and let's all share it. And even if you rent this place, how do you rent it for a cheaper amount of money than going somewhere else that they're going to charge you a lot of money, and that money goes back into the social justice community. And that those were the beginnings, and it's grown beyond. I mean, our initial home, we got kicked out of there, even amongst other social justice activists, because there was homophobia, because there's anti-strong woman sentiment that they're not necessarily happy with feminist women or stuff like that. So but also the community, we were also trying to play a role of not imposing necessarily our agenda, but that we would come together and all of us would come and make different, as a coalition, come together and make decisions. But at some point, people also said, no, the Esperanza also needs to take a lead on a lot of the work. And the Esperanza also saw that, again, that you might call yourself a social justice activist, but you might also be homophobic, misogynist, racist. You could be a white activist around wars in the Middle East, but then not understand what it meant to be a woman of color. So, taking the teachings of Gloria Anzaldúa, of Audre Lorde, of Cherie Moraga, all these queer women of color writers from the 70s and 80s who wrote books like This Bridge Called My Back and Borderlands and many, many other books. It's like they were writing theory that we believed in and that we supported. And so we moved forward with that, as well as the thinking and the values of our abuelas and our great grandmothers and even our mothers, who also said, and we watched, how they were just very giving and supportive and took care of people in their community. So, so that's how we started. That's not a shorthand of anything, but you can't say that to a 35-year-old organization.
That's beautiful. So I grew up in the West Side, and I just recently found out that like all the pictures and the history that's put up like around JT Brack and in that area is all from the work of the Esperanza. And I was like, that's so beautiful. I more recently looked into the work that you guys were doing after living there so long. I was like, how did I never know about this? And it's just deeply meaningful to me that you guys are doing the work that you're doing. Especially as someone like a queer woman who grew up in the West Side and like experienced a lot of homophobia. I think that learning from you all has helped me embrace who I am as a Chicana and like a queer woman. So just wanted to express my gratitude and how express how beautiful I think that the work that you're doing is. Um, so for my for my next question, I wanted to know why Esperanza, like what inspired the inception of the organization? And you kind of touched on that, but really what inspired the name and how you chose the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center to embody all that work that you were doing?
Um, I graduated from college in 1982 and returned back to San Antonio thinking I was going to be a teacher, having certification to teach. But I didn't have any white hair, and I still am 5'2.5", and I wanted to work at Lanier High School, which is where I graduated, and they didn't want me because I looked too young, and then I kept on being interviewed, and time was passing, and I was concerned that uh, I wasn't going to get a job, so I got a job offer with working with Willie Velasquez at the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project as a paralegal. And I thought, well, another thing I was thinking of doing was being an attorney. So, this will teach me. And again, as a paralegal, I was working with Rolando Rios to do single member districting, which was, still an issue. And as we know, voting now more than ever is, under threat. And so that was my job. But what I also saw working there was that the leadership was male, that all the women were, I was one of the higher paying women in a position, in a middle position. I wasn't the, director because I was just right out of college, but I wasn't a secretary. And the secretaries were getting paid, even though they had been working there many, many more years than I had. When I walked in, I was making, $7,000 more than somebody who had been working there for 4 or 5 years or more, right? And then the men were making $24,000 more than I was, right? All the directors were getting paid, like $40,000, where the secretaries were getting paid $9,000. Like, talk about a wage gap. And it's like, okay, this is a civil rights organization, but why are we not paying attention to equity along along the board, right? So that was kind of one of the earlier things, and just where the power was. Queer was not even something they talked about. And when I remember, probably this was a moment when uh, what is it called, when you would make phone calls and you'd leave a message machines were new, and people, I guess, heard me uh, in a conversation, and they found out I was gay, and I think people giggled about it and never talked to me about it. But and at the same time, I was coming out and definitely organizing within the LGBT community. So you know like, where's that organizing happening? And it wasn't happening. Where was the feminist women's organizing? I was reading lots of books, but there were no other folks in the community that I was able to touch base with to be allies. And then in helping to organize the first annual International Women's Day March, which took place in 1985, there was a call from another friend of who became a good friend of mine, is Susan Guerra, and she had been living in Norway for years and had come home and wanted to do the Women's Day March. She did a Women's History Month before any university did it, back in 1984, and it was amazing. And I don't think the city has actually done the same sort of organizing with very little money that what happened in 1984. So anyway, we became friends and we started meeting other people. And it's like, why did it take me to graduate in 82 up to 84 to find friends? Like, that was 2 years. And so it's like, well, there has to be a space that people can gravitate to and that we can all come together, as I mentioned before. And then sitting down and talking and dreaming, the idea of Esperanza comes out of Susan's thinking. But it was like, okay, because Esperanza means hope, literally, but it's also the name of a woman, the name of a girl, and we in San Antonio would recognize that And so again, it's the centering of women and the centering of women of color and the centering of queer women of color, but all of us together. And because of our, again, working in the theory of all these other women of color, it's like we would also understand the plights and the struggles of Black women, Asian women, Arab women, Native women, women of color overall. And yet, as those women of color taught us that it can't be without our allies, it can't be without the men, it can't be without the straight allies, it can't be, all those sorts of things. So that's why the name Esperanza. And then peace and justice was because we're also coming back home from college, from wherever we were coming from, and saying, how come we don't feel that this is our home when this home is all about war? It's about, military city USA. It's about being, not liking that, there were base closures or whatever, or not concerned about the wars in the Middle East, no, not concerned about the wars in Central America. And this was at the essence of the wars in Central America. And so for me, it's like we're spending our taxpayer monies to kill people that
Mm-hmm.
look like our family members, right? And we're sending Latinos, Mexicanos, Mexican Americans from our town
Yeah.
over there to fight their wars, to train them to kill others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where should our taxpayer monies be going to instead of buying bombs and armament just and training, other people? Like, how could we spend that money in the arts, in education, in healthcare, in
Right.
preserving the environment? So it was like, how do you shift that? So we said that's where we support peace, and that's where we support justice, and that peace is the absence of violence, not just of war, but of violence, the violence of hunger, the violence of lack of education and things like that. So that's again a long answer.
That's so important. Like that, there was so much intentionality and depth to a name that also now carries so much weight still in the work that's still being done. And like that also speaks a lot to the consistency of the organization, which is very important. Um, so kind of touching on that, I wanted to know what was the most difficult part in the inception, like the first few years of the Esperanza, and are you still facing any of those same challenges today?
Well, the first problem was there was no money. The first problem was finding a space, and and some people say, like, how did you find the space? And it's interesting again that it is about community and family. I mean, we were struggling looking for a place, and I would come and talk to my mother, and she at some point she was, well, let me ask somebody. It's like she called the priest that I had grown up with, and he's an oblate priest. He's still around. He's probably 90 years old now. He said, oh, the oblates, they have a space, they just got it donated, let's ask them. And so sure enough, they gave us the space for $1 a year. And so that, after searching for about a year, we found this place. But again, it was about asking, turn around, ask the people that are around you, and they'll help you. But then we had a space, everybody helped to clean it up, fix it up, it was prepared, and then there was no money, right? So I'm actually the third director of the Esperanza. Susan was the first director, and I actually went to Cuba to study film that first year and a half. And so after a few months, she said, I can't work here because I'm volunteering and I need money, right? So she quit. But she did, as much programming as she could the first time around. Then another person was Carol Rodriguez, and she became the second director, and she did it for a while. But the same thing, can't survive without having a real job. So then there was no director for a few months. And then when I come back a year and a half later, um, and it's like, here, you can have the Esperanza, if you want it. And so at the same time, um, a board member, well, who, since I hadn't been working there, but, she wrote the first grant, and that's Gloria Ramirez, who's the editor of La Voz. And she wrote a grant to, actually, it was just a letter to a friend of ours, and she's a wealthy white woman from Austin, and she got $6,000. So that was our first grant after, again, being around for a year and a half. So that first year, basically we spent the money, but I didn't pay myself, or I paid myself and gave the money back, right? So for the next year, the same thing. We went from 6,000 to 12,000 to 24,000 to 50,000 and then 75. So up to that point, we had just increased, just doubled it each year until we hit the 75,000. And it's like, okay, this is year 5. And that was the year that the Oblates kicked us out of our building. Not the Oblates, it was actually another organization, the Refugee Aid Project, and under the directorship of this Latino man, indigenous Latino man who was homophobic. So how homophobia and misogyny play a role. So not having money, but then losing the sacred space that was only costing very little money. And so, you know, so that was part of the problem, I think. But it also brought together people who were like, well, wait a minute, we believe in you. And I said, we're either closing down the store, that's the end of the Esperanza, or we find a place that we buy, because with our politics, our vision of social, economic, environmental justice in this city will always, if we rent, we will get kicked out again and again and again. So people saw that, this was a reality. So they said, okay, let's buy it, and we went from buying, being a $75,000 organization to buying a $200,000 building. No banks would fund us, but it was like, okay, everybody came together and started raising monies, having bailes, film screenings, whatever. And then we had a down payment of $40,000 that we got, within 2 or 3 months. And it's like, here's the down payment. And then we paid it off in 6 years, right? And that was all 100% community buying that building. There was a loan from the community, from Partners for the Common Good 2000, which meant that they gave us a loan in 1996 and we had to pay it off by 2000. But again, all that money that we raised came from the community. So no grants, nothing. We were small and we were too radical for this city. So we couldn't get foundation monies here or elsewhere. And so if the community hadn't been there, we wouldn't have bought the building. On the other hand, it's like we were opening up doors. We were open, like how many other organizations, and we were we were age 6 and 7, right? We were babies on some level as an organization. And then all of a sudden we have this 10,000 square foot building that nobody had, no other nonprofits owned their own building. Like the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center is still owned by the theater is still the city's, their offices are still the city's. But that inspired organizations to think about buying their own buildings, and as time passed, and they've come to us many, many times. It's like, how do you buy a building? How do you do it? So financially, that's been a problem, one of the big issues. And our social, economic, our values and our vision of justice are always going to be trouble for the city, because it shifts all the time, right? And we're always ahead of the vision, right? We were ahead of, now everybody's talking about climate justice. Well, we were doing that back in the late 80s, early 90s, and everybody just kind of ignored us and said we were white hippie types. It's like, no, it's also a people of color issue, right? And now people of color are the prominent ones. But for us, again, we're not just an environmental justice group or LGBT group or a women's group. We're like all of those, because they all affect us. And so that sort of vision and values and the sort of work is hard to also, for people to understand. But on the other hand, we're mujeres, and as women, we're raised to be able to, again, be a mother. We have to be the accountants, the cooks, the cleaning women, all those sorts of things. And it's not like we get trained, we just learn it and we try our best. So anyway, you're only down now to question number 3 or something like that.
No, we're already on 5. But yeah, I was gonna say, last summer I did grant writing for NALAC, and I just I was an intern only. And so I remember learning, like, I was like, why do they want you to be fit into a box so bad to give you money? And like, when you don't fit into the box, it's just like, well, there's no way we're going to get it. And that was a big reality shock for me, because these institutions who have so much money to give, and they swear like for social justice initiatives, and there's even in those applications, like they want you to fit into a box, and they want you to like be a perfect little ribbon and tie bow to even reward you with a little bit of crumbs, which was very upsetting for me to learn.
Right. Yeah, you got it.
Um, so I noticed, or as I mentioned earlier, that your work is rooted in the West Side, and that's like where it was incepted. But where does that come from, and how does being positioned in the West Side in comparison to other places in the city guide your mission and its projects?
Well, I would actually challenge that we aren't just a West Side organization. I think there's especially under COVID, we've kind of done most of our programming in the West Side. But if you look at our main space, it's down on San Pedro.
Mm-hmm.
It's at that time, 35 years ago, it was more centrally located. And that was the vision also, that it would be somewhere where people from the east side, west side, north side,
Mm-hmm.
and whatever, east, west, north, south, could come together, and nobody would have to travel that far, and that the connections, it would be accessible by bus, right? So if you didn't have to have a car. And look at that, we're right across Via. So that's again our second home, but even before that we were only like half a mile away from there. So when we got kicked out of our first building and came to the second one, it was with that same vision, being centrally located. However, in subsequent years, what we learned was, here we're asking people to work for justice. Here we're all asking people to get involved in the wars in Central America or the Middle East because of all the wars that were going on there too. Or we were saying, support LGBT rights or the environment or whatever. And we and we were having a hard time. Well, what we recognize is that a lot of people were struggling on their own stuff, right? And that we realized that we had to ground our communities culturally, historically, so that they felt good about themselves. That how can we work for peace and justice for people in 2,000 miles away if we didn't even have the values for our own selves? So that became the work of culturally grounding our communities, and that was really important, because once you know who you are, once you learn to love yourself, once you learn to respect yourself, then you do the same for your children. And then you can say, okay, now I'm going to wake up every day and I'm going to clothe myself, feed myself, clothe my children, send them off to school because it's important, because they're valuable, because I'm valuable. Then you're taking care of that, and then you can start being sympathetic and concerned and to your fellow neighbor that's right across the street, and to the neighbor that's across the country, and across the world, right? But it has to start with us, right, individually. And that the 500 years of colonization plus has really, it is genocide, a cultural genocide, that they took away our language, they took away our history, they took away our roots, and that has continued, right? That we still see portrayal of ourselves on TV and radio, mass media, that's all anti people of color, anti women, anti queer. And so how do you survive that? So you have to be grounded in who you are, and that you know again, it's generation after generation after generation. So if you're lucky, and we know for many of us, graduating from high school is one thing, going on to college is even more profound. But that's usually, again, the place where people, if going to college is where you get the critical thinking skills, right? That you start uh, reading more, beyond what they the texts that were given to you in K through 12, which is again very racist and sexist and homophobic and transphobic and such. So how does, the Esperanza was through our cultural programming, we're offering these ideas through film, through performances, through our newsletter La Voz de Esperanza, but it had to still be deeper than that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we started doing some of the work on the West Side. That's how we started Mujer Artes as well, is how that the women could create pieces of art through clay or photographs or whatever, but that it would start with their stories, with their personal stories. And it's not easy. I mean, we have many, many sets of women, but again, their tendency might be to do art, reflections, even if it's of their own stories, is, well, here's my husband, here are my kids. It's like, well, what about your story as well? And so that's kind of where we started centering that and trying to talk about history and culture and traditions and values, but also challenging that and talking about complexities, right? Because it's not just learning how to dance folklorico music or listening to conjunto music and just getting all excited. It's like, where are the instruments from? Where did this come from? What again? Oh, jaranas. Well, in the state of Veracruz, only men play that. Well, how do you stop that, and how do you get women to start playing that? Or those photos, right? We started doing oral histories of our elders because, as we hear and as it's been said, each person is a book in and of itself. So how do you gather those stories? And so we wanted to reach out to the 80 and 90-year-olds. And then when we tried to talk to them, the women were shyer than the men. And even though, there might be a group of 20 people, 2 of them were men, the men did all the talking, right? It's like, come on. And so that's where the photo idea came. It's like, let's bring photos, let's talk about those photos. And that of, the women started affirming each other, because now it's like, okay, I'm afraid, I'm shy, I don't want to really talk about it, but I'm being asked about that photo, and I'm the only one that knows what's in this photo. Mm-hmm. So so it forced them, but they all wanted to talk anyway, right? I mean, it's not like they didn't want to talk, but this gave them an entry point. And so they started talking, and then they started seeing shared understandings. Even they met each other, and it's like, oh, you lived right there, oh, that's exciting. And then putting those, all of a sudden we have 1,000 photos or 2,000 photos. So what do we do with those photos? And that's when the idea of, well, we could keep them and contain them on the internet, or we could put them on the street, right? And then it's everybody's photos. And people said, the kids are gonna damage them, they're gonna tag them. And it's like, they're not gonna do any of that. You don't know your community, And sure enough, we stopped tagging. Where there had been a wall and it had been tagged, we cleaned it up, put a photo, and then the tagging stopped, right? Because kids, young people see themselves positively portrayed, and that's what they want. And even if they're not blood family, they're family. So so it's, again, all that sort of work. And that's how we've done a lot of work on the West Side. But, just before this, we were doing all this work on the East Side. And I know ex-mayor Ivy Taylor would say, stay on your side, stay on your side. And it's like, no. Even this project of the work on the West Side is not just for the West Side, it's for mm-hmm. everybody. Because I've heard this line, it's like, Mexican American history is U.S. history, and U.S. history is Mexican American history. So the West Side story is San Antonio history, is national, is U.S. history as well, right? But we don't know it. It's not been written. So how do we write it? How do we document it? How do we share it? And how do we make sure people aren't appropriating or misappropriating all of this stuff, and that people have voice and can speak on their own, and also be challenged. So.
That's awesome.
Lesson 6 or 7.
So I know you mentioned Mujer Artes. I wanted to know, what is your favorite program offered by the Esperanza, and why?
Not possible to answer that question. They're all different. They're all special. I'm missing the work that we've done. Sometimes, like we used to have film festivals that were 9 days long. And then the world changed, and people can stay home and watch Netflix, right? And Netflix buys films. So in the past, we could call up a filmmaker in Tunisia and say, we like your film, can we show it? And they'll say, well, it's going to be screening in Canada, talk to the folks in Canada and send it here. Or we could, film Fresa y Chocolate from Cuba. And it's like, we were the first ones in the country to screen it. But nowadays it's like Netflix can talk to all those filmmakers and their folks in distribution centers and they buy it up before you do. So then it's like, but those were amazing because I love film. So you know that was exciting. We used to go. I remember some students from UTSA and Palo Alto. It's like, we saw the films and how can we get them over in our place? So we would take the films over there as well. And so it was fun to have the students curate. Oh, we showed 100 films. We only want to show 5 films. And, okay, let's collaborate. So that was fun, right? But we've also had like, you know, music performances by Lila Downs or uh, Susana Baca, Eugenia Leon, all these folks from Latin America, from Mexico. And when we did, Lila Downs in 2004, nobody knew who she was. And we'd say, well, did you see the Freedom movie? And they're like, yeah. Well, she had this small little singing part. Okay. But we filled the Plaza Guadalupe with 3,000 plus people. It was packed, right? And it was free, and it was, yeah, we targeted the West Side neighborhood, but anybody could come, right? You can't, I mean, we even had a person saying, I'm flying in from Paris, France. And it's like, okay, whatever. but so anybody could come, but it was also free, right? The idea is like, culture shouldn't cost.
Mhm.
And when I go to Mexico, I go to the Zócalos of Oaxaca or Mexico City or Puebla or wherever, and there's always some performance. You have a group of kids playing orchestral symphonic music, and they're not charging. You have somebody playing danzón, and a little group of you know elder folks then playing danzón, and we're all dancing there, and it's free, right? You go to the museums and it's a peso, it's very little, right? So why is it cost money in this country to access culture? So for us, it's like, make it free. In so sometimes we charge. I think the most we charge has been $20, and people are like, man, that's too much. And then other people are like, you never charge enough and you don't respect the artist. And it's like, well, we just want it to be accessible. And
Mhm.
this is a poor community, this is a poor city, this is a poor, again, South Texas is a poor community. So Mujer Artes is a wonderful program. Of course, I love Mujer Artes. But you know we're just about developing the Museo del West Side and all the work that's being done in the Rinconcito. And we have many ideas. We also have access to radio frequency 96.5 FM, and we're going to be building that up. La Voz de Esperanza, again, now is almost as old as the Esperanza, probably 33, 34 years. And that's all done by volunteers, the people who write for it. It goes out all over the country, and then it's on the internet. So um, what, you know, I love all of the programs. I just wish, we had more capacity to do
Yeah.
more of that. And,
Yeah.
but I think what's important for us is, again, like Fresa y Chocolate, that film, the reason I liked it was because it was, one, made in Cuba. Two, it was about Cubans dealing with LGBT issues back in the 1990, 91, somewhere in that time period. And so it brought in at least two different sort of issue related, right? So we had to, maybe straight folks who were allies around Cuba, then coming in with LGBT folks who had never really thought about Cuba, and then they all learn about each other, right? So it's that intersectional sort of thinking, intersectional work that is constant in most of our programming, or if not all of our programming. And there's the organizing. This right now we're doing a lot of work around housing advocacy. Before that, we've been doing a lot of work around water rights and environmental justice, and stopping the nuclear the continued building of nuclear uh, energy and stuff like that. It's our work against gentrification and displacement. all of that and more. It's challenging City Hall for every single policy they enact that
Mhm.
hurts our people. So and it's not separate, right?
Mhm.
If we leave all people are creative people, that there aren't just the artists and the activists and the scholars, but that our gente are also thinking people and theorists as much as somebody that has the opportunity to get a PhD, and that PhD is also a creative, and that person that fixes your car is also a creative and a thinker, like, and that
Mhm.
mother is also the same thing. And that's how we even started Mujer Artes, that there were all these, my mother sewed, my mother, made floral arrangement, but she would never call herself an artist, but everything around us was creative, right? But again, the only people who move forward on being paid to do their work of art tend to be the men, and the women just have to go home and take care and don't have the luxury to have that extra hour or two or the whole day to do their artwork. So we wanted to allow women to also be able to create.
Awesome. So then kind of wrapping a bow on the interview, I wanted to hear your thoughts about what do you envision for the future of the organization?
Future of the organization. Well, I'm looking for people to take over my position. And I think a lot of the Latino arts organizations are also struggling with that, because we've been doing it for many, many years. And a lot of folks, there need to be, the next generation and the next generation and the next generation, but that, are also there not for 2 years or even 4 years or 5 years. The work requires a lot of work and does require long-term kind of commitment. And I don't know that the next generations are about that, right? So what does that mean? But it would be sad to see not just the Esperanza, but the Guadalupe, the Centro Cultural, San Anto, American Indians of Texas, all these different groups, Urban 15, lose out because the next generation, one, it's not that they're not prepared. It's just that, again, if we're offering $50,000 at the top level, because that's how much a lot of our folks would be making at the top level, there, another cultural institution in town might be able to offer 75 or 100 and something thousand. And then it's like, so instead of working for our organizations, they work over there, right? So, and that it's a lot harder to do our jobs than it is for them. They start at 8 o'clock, they're gone by 4 o'clock, and we're still working till 10 o'clock, and we're still, you know, and that's just hard. So, I've heard a lot of people who wants, why would I want your job? You work too much, you work too hard. Um, so those are fears that I have, right, about the future, because I think Esperanza, um, with me being around for all these years and with the community that's really committed to helping to support it and financially has put money into it and physically have been there, because we don't have the staff, they've come in to fill in that, and they've done it for free, that all this time and work, might disappear in a minute, because others aren't ready to jump in and do the same sort of hard work, right? That there's got to be a commitment, not because it's about me or about but it's about the work and for social, economic, environmental, and gender justice, for justice, right? And that our organizations are the ones that have been doing this. Um, Antonia Castañeda, would say, what were those institutions that uh, were around that pushed and promoted culture or history or these things. Again, and for her, who now she's almost 80, she's 79, but she said for her, it came through the church, right? Or that sort of institution, the religious institution. And when looking at photographs or talking to the elders, yeah, the church played that role. The church maintained some of those traditions of the pastorela or the posadas, or you know, the Easter gatherings, and helping indigenous cultures, also do some of that work. And we were the ones in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when we got formed that said, okay, here's another way to come through it and doesn't have to come through the religious institutions. You might not be religious, you might not, so here's an opportunity to kind of do it this way. So what happens if we disappear, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of scary. On the other hand, at least for the Esperanza, we have been able to, where we were struggling early on financially, we've built up uh, donations from individuals. And so we want to keep on maintaining that. And now people are saying, well, they pass away and they might put us in their will. And how do we get more people to do that? And it doesn't have to be old folks, because young folks also pass away, middle-aged people pass away, but that they're thinking about it. And like NALAC and the Guadalupe Esperanza did receive, monies from the, what's her name, that the millionaire woman, I forget her name, Mackenzie Scott.
Oh yeah, I was like,
So, yeah, Mackenzie Scott. She divorced Bezos, Mr. Bezos.
oh yes, I was like,
UTSA got money. All these Latino and African American based institutions got funding, right? So it's not a, it's $1 million for us, and for the Guadalupe it was $6 million for NALAC, but for us that's nothing. It goes away. There's a lot of money that that we've already, instead of going into debt, we can just pay off this or that. But we're more stable financially than we've ever been before. But institutionally, again, is having the young people like yourself, who again don't just come in as an entry level and then leave after a while, but say we're committed to these institutions and we're going to take it to that next level. The museos here, how do we make sure it's growing stronger? The down, the campus, the main headquarters on San Pedro, how do we, continue building it? How do we make sure younger people are still coming through, right? Because once upon a time, when I started Esperanza, I was in my 20s, right? When I was helping to envision it. I am now in my 60s, I am in my early 60s, but, again, it's been 34, 35, 36 years. So, that has to continue to be built up. So, 20, 30, 40-year-olds are continuing to come and continue to pass and share and go even deeper and stronger than ever before, because that, we've built it up. Now just kind of take it to the next level. Because there is still so much work, right? I mean, we're in the West Side, like you said, on some level, but 3% of our community has gone to college, right? We're surrounded. Everybody says you've got UTSA downtown, to the east, you've got Our Lady of the Lake. To the west, you've got St. Mary's a little further west. But our kids aren't going to these schools. They're not going to any schools. They're going to the military. How can we stop that? So for us, is doing more work at that grassroots level to do more of that work that is happening at the universities, but having it happen at the grassroots level, where they're replacing you and me and our voices. They're not replacing us. They're just joining us, right? So they're hundreds and then thousands and then more. And then Terry Castillo is not a rare little council person, being radical, but that they're 10 city council people and a mayor that think the same way, and that they're really changing the city to really protect and conserve and be, loving to Mother Earth and to the vulnerable of this community, to the gente, who have been toiling and struggling and, working for nothing just because they want to do their part. But, they've been ripped away. They've been raped. And we have to stop that, the horrible treatment of our people and our environment. And so that has to stop. And I think a lot of us know that, and a lot of us have worked towards that, and we need that many more of us. Those people who don't vote because they don't believe in the system, because the system has never supported them, right? They might be registered to vote, and they may have voted 2 or 3 times, and then they say, why vote? Because, why go to city council? Why speak out against this? We go and they don't pay attention to us. But again, so what are the leaders? Back again in the 70s around single member districts, before that, we didn't have those districts. We thought, oh, it's all these white people that are getting elected that live in these north side districts, and they're creating policies that don't help, that actually harm our people. So now we need to have districts that represent us, and our folks, we're going to elect them from within, and they're going to support us. That didn't happen. That didn't happen, and still doesn't happen. We're electing people that don't represent us. They represent their puppets, right? For the most part. And I'm not saying everybody, I'm saying many of them. But in the 35-year history of the Esperanza, we've mainly struggled with most of the elected officials who, stop even talking to us, but really vote to support developers, to develop wealthy, people, and continue to perpetuate the same inequalities, racist, and policies that continue to hurt our people. So in the future, we'll have a whole bunch of us. In the future, we are going to change that. And I believe that we can do that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Okay.
Yes. And so really the only other last question I had is this: if there were students watching this, if there was any other organizations in the community that you would want to encourage them to also look up.
There are a lot.
Shout out.
There are a lot, Fuerza Unida, always needing support, always needing help, but also needing long-term help. Other allies are, Southwest Workers Union. Other allies are Texas Organizing Project, the Move Texas, Martinez Women's Center, cultural centers, San Anto, Urban 15, Centro Cultural Atzlan, American Indians of Texas. But also, again, challenge any of these organizations as well to make sure the voices of women are also centered, and queer voices, and working class people voices as well. But there are many, and not to even stop at the local level, that there's the statewide, and there's national organizations. And it's always good to travel, go to Mexico. If you've never crossed the border, please do that and meet a lot of people there. But also look at women of color organizing in the South. There's a lot of Southerners on New Ground. There's just a lot of different groups that are doing lots of good work. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everything that you shared with me and for my class.
Okay, good.
Thank you so much.
Keep me posted. All right.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.